All right, so for the next one, we have Jay and Colleen presenting on their topic of a computational linguistics approach to understanding haiku. And I'm sure everyone knows who Jay is, but just briefly, Jay is the president of the Haiku Society of America and served for 2 years as associate editor of the organization's journal Frogpond. He is a member of the Spring Street Haiku group that meets monthly in New York City. Jay has had his poetry accepted in numerous US and international journals and has published several book collections of his work. He has won multiple US and international haiku contests. And Colleen Farrelly is a machine learning scientist who has been writing haiku and haibun for a few years, as well as other forms of poetry for years before coming across haiku and haibun. Her areas of research include natural language processing and topological data analysis. So I'll hand it over to Jay and Colleen to break down what that means for us.
Thanks.
Okay, so see if I can share screen here. Is that visible to everybody?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, good. So this is a talk that is presented along with my collaborator, Colleen Farrelly. I'm very happy to have met her. I think it was last year. And turns out that we had some common interests in terms of data analysis and science. I think it is, there are people there are scientists and quantitative people in the haiku community, but rarely do they apply any of the techniques or methodologies of those fields to the understanding of art or to poetry. And there's no reason why not. They can be analyzed and understood that way. So we hope to take you through this in a way that's easily understandable to everybody. This is not going to be no formulas, nothing. It's just going to be all very conceptual level stuff. I'll be presenting sort of like the first half of this, which will be maybe about 10 minutes in length. And then Colleen will take over and talk more about the data side. She will do sort of like the second part of it, which would take, I believe, about another 10 minutes or so. And then we're going to just open it up for a pretty long Q&A session after that, just to allow, any number of questions that we can both field. So with that, I shall start. So this is a computational linguistics analysis of winning haiku only. Okay, make that clear at the start. And the question that originally motivated me, and this is based on some work that I presented last year at this conference, was what is it that makes for a great haiku? Because many of us are here because we love haiku, but we're writers and readers, and we want to know, wow, what made that one so beautiful? What made that so great? You read this poem, and you just say, I wish I could write something like that. And so that's sort of what we'd like to try to find out here. And this question, of course, traditionally has been analyzed in a more qualitative and literary critique sort of perspective, in which mostly contest judges will describe what they liked about a particular poem. So something won a contest, the judge will give like maybe 2, 3, 4 paragraphs, description about the structure, the content, the themes. They liked it because it used good juxtaposition, because it had a concrete imagery, because it was a sort of nice connection between nature and human nature. And so there are all sorts of ideas that have been floated around and have been used in literary analysis. But this alternate perspective that we're talking about, which is to examine it from a more quantitative, statistical point of view, has not really been explored sufficiently. And I have to say, in fact, just to go back for 1 second, there is an entire field called empirical aesthetics, which started in Europe, but now as a number of researchers in America are actually involved in this. And it's the scientific study of beauty and art and all kinds of art. So scientists are now studying music what makes for emotional music, or, when you look at a painting, what makes you want to look at a painting longer, and where do people's where do people's gazes travel when they're looking at a painting, and so forth. So people might not be aware of this, but traditionally, it was C.P. Snow who talked about the two fields of art and science as being separate, and he said it was a shame. He wished they could come together because they would be able to mutually inform one another quite well. So, for those of you that are not aware, there actually has been for several decades a movement of scientists who have been studying art, and it's sort of a popular area now. It's beginning to take off and be quite popular. There's a conference every 2 years that's organized, and so forth. Okay, so computational linguistics. This is one quantitative way to study language, is CL. And it's an interdisciplinary field that's concerned with the computational modeling of natural language phenomenon, which means languages that are either spoken, heard, written, or read by humans. So typically we talk about natural languages and formal or machine languages. So natural languages are the ones that human brains are exposed to early in development and seem to have a predisposition to acquire quite quickly and to use. But that's in contrast to more formal languages such as logic, mathematics, computer code, which are much more highly structured and formalized and used, by people, but also mostly by machines. I should say also that there's an applied and less theoretical field of computational linguistics, sort of like a subfield of it, which is called NLP, or natural language processing. But sometimes these two terms are used interchangeably. Okay, natural language processing and prose. So historically, these methods have been used to do things like you'd expect like Google engineers to do. They translate languages. They are used for speech recognition and synthesis programs, search algorithms. When you type a key term into Google, how does it look up? It has to use language and understanding of language and meaning and semantics in order to be able to understand what it is that you're looking for and to provide you with that information. So that's another one of the fields that it's being used and applied to. But there has been almost no, or very little, I should say, comparatively speaking, application of these techniques to the understanding of verse. Okay, so verse is the language that poets use, right? This is poetical language. It's typically characterized by rhythm and meter. It has metrical structure. If we're talking about traditional Western poetry, that's going to be iambic pentameter or something else. And this, of course, is in contrast to prose, which is the sort of natural language that people use in everyday communication, spoken language, for example. So there's sort of like there's the formal and natural languages, but even within natural language, there's spoken language, and then there's verse. There's sort of like the language we all use in our everyday lives, and then there's artistic language, and it's the artistic language that, of course, concerns most of us here. So prose is usually expressed in sentences, and it has a discernible grammatical structure. It follows a set of rules. This is, what you learned when you were in elementary school, and they were drilling the grammar into your head and teaching you all those rules that you hated so much because it seemed like it was just, why do I need to know this stuff? I can speak and write just fine. Whereas verse is organized differently. Okay, so verse is typically organized into lines or groups of lines, and it's characterized by rhythm and cadence. And poetic verse, which would include haiku and other Japanese poetic forms, do adhere to rules. And of course, this is a perennial debate in the haiku community, right? This has been going on ever since haiku existed. Is what is a haiku? And then, there's some people that say, well, here's a definable set of rules. It's a concrete moment in time. It involves imagery, involves metaphor, so forth, and so on. But then it seems that for every rule that you can apply to haiku, I oftentimes find an example that breaks that rule and does it in a way which is amazing and effective. So this is one of the interesting paradoxes of art, is that it's governed by a set of rules, and typically to be a good artist, you need to learn those rules. But to be a really good artist, you have to learn how to break them. And and there's almost like a set of rules for breaking the rules, right? There's like the original rules, and then another great field that somebody should probably study is like, what are the rules for breaking the rules? Because sometimes you can break them effectively, and you have a wonderful poem, and sometimes you break a rule and it's just like, it doesn't work out. So this is what is so vexing about art, and what has made it a bit more difficult to study from a science point of view is that it's just less organized. It's less structured. It doesn't follow organization in the same way that normal language does. Just to give you some examples of how ordered natural languages are, there's a set sequential ordering of word type. So you have adjective noun parents, right? So in English you would say the greenhouse, but in Spanish you would say la casa verde. So you have adjective before the noun or noun before the adjective. And what matters here is not so much what the specific rule is, but that there are those rules, and those rules are followed in the language. Another example of how language is ordered is it's hierarchical. So I don't know if you ever remember seeing some of Noam Chomsky's work, where he sort of has these phrase diagrams where you can say, okay, well, you have a noun, you have a verb, and then that verb gets grouped into a verb phrase, and then you have noun phrases and verb phrases that can group together at the sentence level. So you have individual words, actually you have morpheme, you have phonemes, then morphemes, and then words, and then word groupings, and then sentences. So the whole thing is, I want to say like a pyramid scheme. It's all pyramidal, where you start with low-level units, and then those units get assembled together in specifiable ways to create larger meaning. And the grammar or the syntax are the rules that govern how those elements are combined, and the semantics is the meaning that gets expressed from it. Okay, so verse and natural language processing. This makes use of computational analysis of poetry challenging. It's less structured than normal language, and so it's more difficult to understand. So for these reasons, the computational linguistics and the NLP approach have not often been used to study verse. They've been applied to prose, natural language, but not to verse. There's been some work by a linguist, James Pennebaker, who has approached linguistics from more of a psychological perspective. And he's done some work looking at how one can understand states of mind through examining writing samples. So you can actually look at writing samples and you can determine based on, for example, use of pronouns, whether somebody's depressed or not, or what type of mood they're in. You can examine, you can sort of extract emotional valence, whether it's positive or negative affect based on the types of words. So it's possible to pull not just meaning, but emotion also, and psychological states from the written word. You also have things like genre and author classifications. So you could submit, for example, text, and then to a program, let's say, and it could determine whether it was an example of postmodern 20th century contemporary literature, or whether it was an example of Elizabethan. So stylistic classifications and author, even provenance, can be determined from these kinds of analyses. So it's likely that this plays a role in haiku and senryu differences. Okay, we already know that haiku tends to be more about nature, and senryu is about psychology, internal human states, nature versus human nature. And so we could, again, apply these techniques to sort of to tell the difference between whether a poem is a haiku or a senryu. And in fact, some of the findings that we're going to present today would suggest that we might be able to write a program like that. Okay, so purpose of the current study. So what we seek to do here is to study haiku and senryu in this way. And there are a couple of motivating questions that we can ask. For example, how do basic linguistic metrics and norms in these poetic forms differ from those used in everyday language? So we're not going to look at this right now in this presentation, but going forward, Colleen and I are interested in comparing winning haiku to just quote unquote normal haiku to see if there's what is it about that makes the winning haiku different from the sort of run-of-the-mill versions. Some other questions we can ask are, how do haiku writers differ in their use of things like determiners, nouns, verbs, adjectives, and pronouns? Do these usages differ between different kinds of genres like haibun, haiga, haiku, senryu? And are there any discernible changes that occur over time? One of the results that we're going to present is that we were able to find actual stylistic changes over time. So I'll talk a little bit about the methodology, and then I'll pass this over to Colleen. I was on the sort of data gathering side of this, and she was on the analysis side. So she'll address more how we actually looked at that. So what we decided to do was to use contest-winning haiku as our sample. In fact, this is the same sample that we had used in my presentation last year when I had done a sort of more qualitative breakdown. But we already had the data, so we thought let's continue to use it. So the data source was the Harold G. Henderson haiku contest winners, dating from 1976 to 2021. So one of the examples we used this was that it spanned a fairly wide range of times, going back all the way, spanning several decades worth. So we could look at stylistic trending. We also looked at the HSA Senryu contest, the Gerald Brady. Those don't go back quite as far, but we still included them. And those are from 1988 to last year. The variables that we input were the actual poem, so we put in the actual text of each poem, the number of lines, because some of these are monoku and some of these are 3-line haiku, a smaller number were 2-line. Their placing, which was whether or not they were first place, second place, third, or an honorable mention, and their year of publication to look at sort of chronological things. Okay, so I had some of my research assistants collect the data, put it into a spreadsheet, and then we passed it off to Colleen, and she's going to talk now and next and talk about the actual analysis side. So Colleen, please take it away.
So we wanted to understand poems by using algorithms. Let me share this. Yeah, I think that'll work better. So the basic way that we wanted to kind of understand what's in the poems and be able to process this to use statistics is to first tag the number of words and punctuation marks that exist. So we wanted to see what was in there. And then we wanted to see how the words broke down into these different parts of speech. So we take nouns, we take verbs, we take prepositions. And then we compared poem groups for differences in length, punctuation, and parts of speech to understand how haiku and senryu are different, how first place poems are different from other poems, and how poems evolve over time. So we looked at the comparison of haiku and senryu, and we found that senryu has more adjectives, verbs, lines, and personal pronouns like he, she, I, me, his, hers, than haiku has. Some of these are pretty expected. So poems that are more about human nature, we would expect more personal pronouns. With senryu, we actually found that there are fewer overall words and punctuation marks than in haiku. So less punctuation, we think, might reflect a tendency not to use dashes or other cutting designations in senryu, and perhaps some of this has evolved over the years. When we take a look at how things change over time, we see differences in punctuation and length. We were surprised by the brevity. So we're not really sure why these poems tend to be smaller, but we think that there may be some monoku trends that are influencing these findings. So these are some things that we found. We're digging a little bit deeper into this, hopefully with a bigger set of poems to understand why some of these differences might exist. We also wanted to look at first place poems versus other winners. Are there any differences in which poems actually win first place? And we found that there are. First place winners have more punctuation. They also have fewer nouns, verbs, personal pronouns, adjectives, and adverbs. So they tend to have more punctuation, but they're not using many parts of speech. So they're pretty brief. So some of our takeaways are that these first place poems are very brief, but they do use more punctuation. Some poems are less than 6 or 7 words long. One of our hypotheses on why this might be is that poetry tends to have more distilled language to convey ideas in prose, and haiku and senryu tend to be the most distilled types of poems. These are some of the briefest poems that are written. So it makes sense that first place poems might do better on the brevity than other poems. One of the things that we've looked at is working memory limitations. So this may explain why most of these poems are about 7 words long. There's a long-standing theory in cognitive science that has to do with the capacity for working short-term memory. And this has been found to be about 7 things plus or minus long. So 7 words plus or minus 2 makes a lot of sense in this case. This also means that most people can't hold a lot more than this in conscious awareness at one time. So a really good haiku or a really good senryu kind of falls into the sweet spot of what people can remember the best within one thing. We also wanted to analyze time trends to see if poems are getting shorter or longer or using more punctuation over time. So we used a group of statistical models to find differences in patterns over time. So we wanted to look at senryu versus haiku and first place poems versus other placings. We also looked into how to predict future trends. So we want to understand what's going to happen next with our contest data. We did find some time trends. So this blue line here is the first place senryu, and this orange line is the other winning senryu. First place poems tend to exhibit cyclical behavior for a number of words between 7 and 11 words. And other winning poems tend to lag on these trends. So we can see here we have this downward trend starting a little bit earlier for these poems, and the upward swing starting a little bit earlier for these first place senryu. we do see different patterns over time between haiku and senryu, suggesting that they aren't influencing each other, but we do have a pretty constant effect of these first place poems influencing the trends of other winning poems in the following years, which is kind of interesting. There's definitely the cyclical behavior. Poems kind of go up and go down in length over time. Non-first place poems tend to lag on these trends, suggesting that these first place poems may be influencing what people are writing the next year. However, this cyclical behavior has been longer in recent decades. And one of our hypotheses is that one of the drivers is monoku. So shorter poems are appearing more frequently, and this may be washing out some of the trends of a 3-line poem that would be trending upwards in the number of words. Particularly, we see this trend in the 2010s when monoku became more popular. We're hoping to do some more research on this and understand how our quote unquote average haiku differs from our winning haiku. We're taking a set of haiku published in Frogpond and comparing that to our contest data. And we're also hoping to analyze sentiment and subject matter a little more deeply. Thank you for your attention. Here are our email addresses. Feel free to reach out with questions or comments, or, hey, I've been seeing this trend in the data lately.
Thanks so much, Jay and Colleen. That was definitely a lot of food for thought. I think we had a first question in the chat, which is, have we done any statistical analysis showing that monoku are on the mean shorter than a 3-line or other arrangement?
We don't have a sufficient sample size in this, but hopefully with the bigger sample size, we'll be able to look at monoku versus 3-line haiku and senryu. But they're not all that common in our contest winning haiku and senryu samples.
Thanks for that. And I think, oh, go ahead, Jay.
No, I was just going to say, my experience, and this is that typically monoku are shorter than 3-line poems. We don't have the data to show that yet, but I mean that's part of their appeal, is their brevity. Sometimes you do get a much longer one, like about a freight train or something. So they can be deliberately made longer, and I think that's sometimes to induce a particular effect. But I wouldn't be surprised if we look at if we compare the averages, that the monoku just would end up being shorter.
I think Mike Railing has his hand up.
Yeah, just curious, have you guys thought of approaching Charles Trumbull and analyzing his database over the last many, many years? He's got modern haiku and a bunch of stuff. He's got to be thousands and 8,000 or something poems. Just a thought.
His database has more than 500,000 poems.
Okay.
Wow.
Thank you, Michael. Have you guys thought about popping that one in?
So, so when you say that he has the poems, the problem is that these poems have to be coded and then entered into into cells in a spreadsheet. So if he has those poems, what we had to do, I mean, we had the poems too. I mean, we had the poems on the HSA website. So, but we had to break them down, separated by, slashes, and then we had to enter the numerical data that's associated with each one. So that's a very time-consuming process. If he has that, then yeah, I'll be calling him up at 5 o'clock. But that's the difficult part, is first of all, getting the poem into a format, because I don't know, Colleen, did you want to talk a little bit about the program that you're using and how the input works and so forth?
Sure. I'm using some Python code to parse out the poems. So if there's something in like a SQL database that just has The poems, that would be something that would be fairly easy to do. Just put it into a CSV or ingest it. But basically, we're doing that, and then we're applying a few statistical models. So we have a time series model. It's not a fractal model, but it does decompose the trends using linear algebra. For those who are more math oriented, basically we're breaking down the trends and kind of cleaning out the noise from the trends.
He's got it in a database, so it should be exportable, but I'm just saying, for the fun of it, you certainly might want to talk to him because he's been doing it. I didn't realize he's gotten up into the hundreds of thousands, but he keeps finding stuff all over the place. So, and I think it would be just sort of cool. I'm a geek too, so I think you should be able to pull it in pretty easy. If it isn't in SQL, you can convert it pretty easily. But just a thought.
Cool.
Lots of other questions here.
And there was one related a little bit to what you mentioned, Colleen, about fractal analysis and whether that's been tried, or chaos mapping to see if there are pattern trends.
So I'm taking a more statistical approach to it. The method is called singular spectrum analysis, which basically decomposes the time trends. I've thought of looking at some other types of time series models, but they don't work very well on our data.
And just so people maybe have a better understanding of this, when we talk about fractal analyses and time series data are data that basically you're plotting some dependent measure and how it changes over time. So if you have fractal behavior in time series data, when you look at things at one scale, like at a large scale, and then you break it down, you look at a smaller scale, you see similarities. So for example, the stock market is a classic example of time series data, because trends in stock going up and down, like if you look at it from a month, like yearly to monthly to weekly to daily, they're not exactly alike, but there are similarities. And chaos theory is sort of like getting at the kind of those sorts of relationships.
I had a question. If you were analyzing the winning haiku, then what is the non-winning haiku that you've analyzed in order to say that the winning ones have this? Does that necessarily mean that the non-winning ones don't as much? And what would be the winners versus the non-winners in terms of the indicators that you're looking at?
That's going to be our next step. We just collected the data on just Frogpond submissions.
Okay. And I'm sort of really surprised that you included an analysis of monoku along with the 3-line haiku, simply because it's a different kettle of fish. It is a haiku, but because it's structured so differently, it doesn't seem like, you can say that monoku have this and haiku have that, but it just sort of just struck me as strange that rather than saying we don't have enough monoku to include them in the analysis or to analyze them separately. I just don't understand why their markers were included in your overall study.
That's a good question. It'd be interesting. There weren't that many. There were more, I think, starting at about 2010. How many total do we have? Do you remember, Colleen?
It's just a handful, maybe like 10 to 20 total out of all.
Then that would not affect. You're right. That wouldn't affect your overall results. Okay.
It'd be interesting to see if we subtracted that out and then reran the analyses, whether it would change things, and that's something that we could do. But yeah, it was fairly small compared to the total number of poems. It probably was like 5% or less or something like that.
Less.
Yeah.
Yeah. We might have more with using the database or our new collection of poems, though. So that would probably give us a sufficient sample size to separate out the monoku.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, here's an interesting one from the chat. Were there any concrete poems or uniquely structured visual works among the winners' samples?
There may have been some that used indentation, but we converted all of them into an identical format. So basically it was line 1, space, / space, line 2, space, / They were all converted into that format so they could be parsed equivalently by the program. So if there was some sort of concrete, arrangement of the words in 2-dimensional space, it got lost.
Yeah, I will say that there's probably some computer vision applications that could be done with Haiku to understand visually what makes a good Haiku, but we haven't looked at any of that.
That would be really interesting and difficult to do, because then it would be cross-modal, right? Because you'd be looking at the linguistic analysis of the haiku and then doing a sort of pattern analysis and then seeing if there are equivalences. Worthwhile as a future, the future study, yeah. Because there are, we're talking about empirical aesthetics, and there are well-known rules of composition, and where you place, for example, actually you could do a purely visual thing. You could look at where you do the placement of the poem and, visually, and how that relates to the other visual components of the image. That could be just purely within a single domain, but that's very interesting to see if the meaning of the poems themselves, how that's related to the meanings and the arrangement and composition and all the other aesthetic factors that go into the photo. Sorry, Colleen, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities for what can be done, especially given all of the AI tools that exist.
Yeah, there was a question actually about
Forget the AI tools
AI.
using for analysis. You gotta, not for anything, folks. You gotta start worrying about AI writing the poems. I mean, no, I'm not even see. You got AI writing full essays.
Oh yeah, I know.
Right now. That
Yep.
Sorry.
No.
Actually,
go ahead.
There's actually software that can write Edgar Allan Poe poems based on a collection of his poems that are input. Language generation is a big part of NLP right now.
I just popped a link into the chat about an article titled "Robots Are Writing Poetry and Many People Can't Tell the Difference."
There's actual different versions of the Turing test. I don't know if you're all familiar with the Turing test, right? Which is, something presented by a machine versus a person. If you can't tell the difference, then the machine is the same as a person. And there have been, for a long time now, there's been music generators that can create music. There was one program, this was even as far back as the 1990s, where the guy had it was either a Chopin, I think it was a Chopin piece, and then he composed a piece, and then he wrote a program to compose another piece that was in the style of Chopin. So people were presented with these 3 different alternatives. They couldn't tell the difference. They said the computer version was written by the master composer. And they said that, so we're getting to the point where you cannot tell the difference.
I think someone also mentioned in the chat about whether there might be robots judging haiku contests in the future.
Yeah, that's us. Oh. Hi, Jay. It's good to see you, my friend. I just have to put in my 2 cents here. And maybe it's only worth 2 cents, but
I doubt that.
I will say that I agree with Dave Lanoux that the true winners
You froze up.
We got you.
Did you lose you?
Take it, Dave.
Well, I was just saying, I think you have a good sample, but you said best. I wouldn't use that word. I would say just winners. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I agree. And another thing I wanted to say had to do with translations of our haiku into other languages. Because it's very important, I've learned, that you have a translator that understands haiku, not just a translator who is fluent in Polish or what have you. They have to understand.
There's some bandwidth issues here.
Or that's a pregnant pause.
And I learned a lot from working with Japanese poet translators who translated my poems. And I've had other ones in Italy. I've had a friend in Italy that translated some of my poems that was not familiar with haiku, and they were all wrong. So then I had to, search around for some Italian poet that was really familiar with haiku, and I did it with Luca Sensei for some of my poems, and Giulio Tedeschi is another that really understand haiku and know how to translate it and convey, the real meaning and suggestiveness. And then also getting back, so that has to do with translations. Okay. And the other one is with the contests. And
yeah, because Alan and I had judged a few of the Nick Virgilio student ones, and I'm just sorting through them with Robin and Henry, the big pile. And
went through 6,000.
And then when we saw who were the winners, I said, "Are you kidding me? That one that we selected and put on the big pile of the 500 or whatever," I says, and didn't win. I says, how's that possible? Yes. Well, so there were some students that really wrote some fine sentences.
Really great stuff.
And they did not become the winner. I just want to say something too about you guys doing this when you talked about science and art and stuff, because a lot of the teachings, I do a lot of teaching in traditional ecological knowledge, native science stuff, and then when they do the STEM stuff that they teach at school, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and a lot of the stuff that we're bringing to native science and traditional knowledge is to put that art piece in there. So a lot of the native community are teaching STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, art, and
good for them.
So that's kind of the thing that I talk about in bringing art in the sciences, because in Western science, the art and sciences are like this, and in the native cultures, the sciences are like this. There's no separation between the two. So good to keep the science piece on it is nice.
Yeah, and also when getting back to the contest thing, like who were the judges? That's a big question too. Okay. Because a lot of judges can be very subjective. And if you're going to be a judge, you have to sort of learn to rise above that. You're a poet who loves peonies. So you see a poem of peonies there, and it's, that's great, this wins the contest,
Yeah. So anyway, I count about five or six questions there. Let me. I want Colleen to talk about the translation stuff in a bit because she does translation. But I think part of this issue of subjectivity of judges and comparing the contests to the control sample has to do with sample size. And so I think when you just keep entering more and more poems, that sort of thing tends to average out. Okay, this is one of the things that you do is that, we have just HSA contest winning poems. That's it. We want to expand this to include Heron's Nest and Modern and all winning. So ultimately, my goal, hopefully, would be to just have like a vast data set of all the winning poems and a very, very large equivalent, perhaps random sample of other poems that are extracted from, journals, a wide span, a spectrum of different journals. And when you have high sample sizes like that, a lot of these this stuff that's noise, like the subjectivity, tends to sometimes go away. So anyway, do you want to talk about the translation stuff? The lost in translation?
Well, okay, no.
So
Well, I don't know how we can, go ahead, never mind. I'll get on later.
So with translation, that's a big challenge for machines right now. The structure of poetry doesn't translate very well to what machines can mimic very well. So definitely something that you could probably parse out what was done by the human and what was done by the machine. That being said, there are some tools for certain languages where you can actually extract meaning in different languages. So you could look at the differences between translation and the original with some of these newer NLP tools that are coming out that can handle multiple languages. The ones we're using are just built for English, though.
Adelaide, do you want to go ahead with your question?
It was just an observation, a comment that the winning poems are short, and they are shorter, and each year they seem. You said they were shorter and shorter. Poems that appear in journals seem to be shorter and shorter. Well, is this because this whole era of us with technology, we do not think, we do not speak, we text, we Twitter, we jot things,
Yep.
we do not speak in full-blown sentences. We do not express ourselves. I'm not saying we have to go back to Henry James, and write volumes when what could be said in a paragraph. But I'm dismayed to think that haiku is going to get shorter and shorter. I know there are one-word haiku, and they have been published, but, that could get to be ridiculous. You say one-word haiku, mountain, river. Okay, leave that to the river, to whatever, the reader to do whatever he wants with that word river. I mean, I am just dismayed to think that shorter poems are going to be winners.
I don't think we necessarily get to the one word haiku. What we found is there tends to be like a bottom and a top threshold for what comes out as a good poem. But we have considered kind of the pressure on language over time of email coming into play, texting coming into play, Twitter coming into play, emojis coming into play, and the shortening of language in general. I think there's a bottom limit on that, though. I haven't found a lot of very, very short poems. I think 5 words was the shortest poem that we found among contest winners. So I think that 7 ± 2 is probably the sweet spot where you have the contrast of images within something that's short enough for humans to kind of hold in their head.
But writers are supposed to use words. What do we have if we don't use words? I mean, you are eliminating the words. So what is there to write about? Why write at all if you're going to shrink everything down? Maybe
it even gets less than one word. You have emoticons. I sometimes get texts from people where I just get like a string of emoticons and there's no text. And, so that's even like less than a word. And you have to sort of ponder, what are they meaning by, by having a little picture of a baby next to a stool, next to a tree? So yeah, it's a new form of communication. I mean, it's one way of looking at it. It's almost like the emergence of a new type of language. But I agree with Colleen. I think there's definitely, what we saw in our data is there's a lower limit. And I think there's a sort of, the sort of ideal, the poems are going to sort of bounce back and forth between probably 5 as the lower limit and maybe 7 or 8 as the upper limit, in terms of this winning category that we analyzed.
Adele? Alp is early here. And then, well, not all haiku are getting shorter.
Well, I hope not.
There's a variety of haiku poems. Each poem is a thing in itself, and you treat it as itself. So
I lost we lost your voice. Lost everybody's voice.
I think the AI overlords are cutting Alan off.
You noticed that, huh?
Philosophical pauses.
Exactly. And, treat each thing as itself, but because there's a lot of breadth in haiku, even though it's considered a very limited form in a sense, there's a lot of freedom in there. We can do.
We also look, what's interesting is that variation. So one of the most basic things in statistics is that you have central tendency and then you have dispersion. So you have things like the mean, the mean, the median, or the mode. Then you have standard deviation, variance, things that describe the spread of the distribution around the averages. And what we're getting at here in terms of length is looking at these dispersion measures. So that's something that could actually very easily can be analyzed. And I'm glad we presented this work here, because we could look at that. We could look at how, for example, variance changes over time. And that would be another way of our examining, another dependent measure for looking at these trends.
Jay and Colleen, I wonder, this might be really hard to code, but could you also search for a semantic, what I was talking about yesterday, what Ezra Pound found in the Haiku, a leap, a juxtaposition, a shift? Because I agree with Adele, a haiku needs at least 2 things happening usually. And there's that. And the other question I have, so one is like, can you test for a leap, or do all the winning haikus have that? And the other question, before I forget it, is how can the winning haikus be the shortest ones with the most punctuation? I'd love to see an example of how do they squeeze more punctuation into a shorter poem?
A lot of ellipses.
I think the answer to your question, David, is that they're using punctuation to substitute for verbiage.
Yep.
Dots.
Yes.
Yep.
It's implied meaning.
Dashes.
The Kareji and the cutting words, they're implying the meaning, so they're not having to say it. So they're using they're using the M dashes, the M dashes, the ellipses to allow the reader to perform an inference, and which is the satisfying part of reading these things. So.
That's interesting. So it'd be interesting to know if that's a typical aspect still, because that's what Pound thought was the big thing about haiku in the beginning. And, is that still happening after that ellipses? Are we having a shift?
Yeah. One thing that I found when I was looking in the data, it seems like it was pretty popular in the late 70s and early 80s, and it seems to be coming back more and more these days.
Now, put this in. Dave, I would just like to say, in one of our episodes, when I was talking with Cor Van Heuvel on the history of the English language, senryu, had to deal with Pound, and how, as his poem in the station at Metro, another version, he had removed the semicolon, and how that totally changed the meaning of the poem.
So we are at time. We are over time, but this is clearly a very engaging topic. And we still have
over time.
we still have 3 people with their hands raised.
No.
So luckily, the next session is a social hour. So if folks are okay to stay behind a little bit for a few more minutes, continue the conversation, and if Jay and Colleen are okay to stick around to answer a few more questions, that'd be great. Because I know Sean O'Connor and Mike Friedenberg have had their hands up for a while. So Sean, would you like to go first since you were first?
Yes, and Mr. Katanuma also, who I think is Japanese. I'd like to go back to Japan for a minute. When I lived for 5 years in Japan, you would never hear a discussion like this among haiku people. It just wouldn't. So there's you guys, I think, have all generated a kind of consensus, and there are other consensuses out there. And I'm not in America. I'm here in Ireland, and in Europe, I hear completely different narratives, especially in countries like Germany and so on, which I'm in touch with on a weekly basis. I hear different narratives in Croatia, in Romania. I speak Romanian. And I will say this about, I'll just give you a couple of quick, in terms of shortness, a haiku is not short. A haiku is not long. Short is a meaningless word. It's a relative word. What the Japanese, to me, and I'd be interested in another Japanese voice in this, the one thing I heard consistently in Japan is that a haiku is already too short at 17 syllables, so you should expand it always to use the space you have. So when they take out a word, they actually try to replace a word. And we just don't do that. And the second thing about the Japanese is they have a word, Giamari. A Giamari haiku means a haiku of more than 17 syllables. And I have identified 36 of Basho's haiku that are 23 syllables long. And I have never encountered one that is less than 17. So we're on a different wavelength when we're talking about how short it is. And I am sick to the teeth of editors writing back and saying, you could cut this. And I'm going, why? I've already cut it. I've already cut it a lot. And I think that we need to broaden the discussion and get back into the basics of what the Japanese actually say about haiku, and get away from this sort of inward-looking short is better. And incidentally, I'll leave you with one last thought. Tundra, and any one-word haiku, is not a haiku and can never be a haiku, but what it is a poem. And I accept the validity of all poetry. But there's another Japanese word we need to inject into this, and that's the word tanshi, which means short poems. A haiku is a form of tanshi. So is a senryu. And so are many other, like a tanka is a form of tanshi. And what we're really doing is we're writing tanshi all the time and calling them all haiku. And I think that's a fundamental error. Now, what I mean by that is we've lost the sense of what distinguishes a haiku from a senryu, from a one-liner. A one-liner is not a haiku. A haiku is 575, meaning 3 lines, not always of a certain number of syllables in Japan. And there is a Japanese gentleman here who can correct me if I'm wrong on all of this, but tanshi is an important word to inject. It means short poem, and not all short poems are haiku. And finally, the Japanese do not write generally less than 17 syllables, and often consistently write a lot longer. And I think we've just got the wrong handle. So I'm delighted with Adelaide Shaw for coming in so strongly and pointing this out, that there is a thing called too short. And I'll leave you with one last idea. A haiku, at least our poem has to be enough, regardless of its length. So I hope that's helpful. I'd be really interested to hear. There's 2 more people with their hands up, or 3. Sorry.
I'm glad you said. I've always thought tundra is not a haiku.
Oh my God.
But it is a poem. It is a poem. It is a poem.
It is a poem. Tundra, with all that white space around it on the page.
It is a poem.
I want to say that the Japanese no longer own haiku. They started it. We own it. We're English language.
Sorry, who's we? Who's we?
I'm a member.
Sorry, I got to stop you there. I got to stop you there. I got to object. No, you don't. I'm sorry, I got to cut across you there. That's I really disagree profoundly with the idea we do not own haiku. We, the English-speaking world, that's an arrogant idea. Sorry, I can't buy that.
Let me,
No.
if I could interject just for a second here. Sean, so yes, of course, you bring up this very interesting idea of cultural differences across the arts. And this has been studied as well, and this can be studied. And so, for example, I would be very interested in learning what are the length differences between Japanese haiku and German haiku and English language haiku and Gaelic haiku. And then being able to explain those differences, perhaps based on the structural organization of those languages. So if, Japanese syntax is ordered in a certain way, right? Or we can extract certain metrics and describe it, in a certain way. Can we use those factors to predict things like length and other differences? So, this isn't really an argument. This is a false argument in my mind, because of course arts are going to differ between cultures. They always do. I mean, look at stylistic music differences. I mean, to say that anyone, when we don't say that like rock and roll is music. I mean, we just say it is a genre, as a style. And then, so the question then becomes, how do you explain that style? What are the interesting ways in which that particular culture, that particular group of people evolved over time such that they created art in that particular way?
Yeah, and I'm a musician, and I can tell you that rock and roll is not a 5/4 rhythm. There are basics, and we do need to sort of, I think, return to the basics, because I just say one thing, because Dr. Lanoux, I strongly object to the idea that we own haiku, because whoever this we is, I'm not part of that we. You know what I mean?
Well, so we'll leave that for another time. So it's 5 o'clock now, and we're gonna break now for our social hour. So this is slightly different. Yesterday we had the poetry readings, and this time it's more broader. So it's just sort of like, we're gonna put everybody up, let everybody come in, and you can direct if you want to speak with somebody directly. You could do that auditory. We don't want to have a million competing voices, but we direct chat. So directing a chat to somebody would be a great way of doing it. We could, if there's requests for breakout rooms, if a small group of people want to meet up and have a group discussion, you can put in a request for a breakout room, and we can try to accommodate that. We just want to try to avoid a sort of chaos free-for-all. But the idea is to just schmooze, talk, get to know one another, expand your social network of haiku people. So that's what we're going to transition into now. And I think Michael Henry Lee is going to be doing this one again. No, sorry, it's Jacob. It's Jacob.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'll be moderating this. If anybody, welcome everybody to the social hour. If anybody would like to try to break into a breakout room, we can try and arrange that. If people have questions about how to send individual chats to people, I'm happy to try and answer questions about that. There are still, there's two hands up. Sean, your hand is still up, and Michael, your hand has been up. You've been waiting for a while, Michael, if you want to jump in there.
So we can continue discussing things, or you can just talk to whoever it is that you feel like talking to. So
can we just say rules. Thank you, Jay, and thank you, Colleen, and by the way, good stimulating discussion and argument among poets, I don't think should be shied away from. But Jay, thank you, and thank you, Colleen, especially for the stimulation.
Good.